beginning in chapter 12, verse 17, and then reading through to 13, verse 8. So Romans 12, beginning in verse 17. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. May the Lord add his blessing of the reading of this portion of his holy and inspired word. So you'll probably, after we've had our lesson today, looking back at that passage and reflecting on it, you'll see why I chose it. Because there's a great struggle that takes place between three characters that we're going to look at today, which is the Pope of the time, Alexander III, and Thomas A. Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and England's King, Henry II. And so we're going into a new study here this morning. Last time that we were together, we were looking at St. Bernard and the conflict that he was having with Abelard and Arnold, and so we wrapped that up last time we were together. So we're starting a new subject, a new chapter in Miller's church history. It's chapter 22, and it's titled The Encroachments of Rome in England, AD 1162. So we're now in the 12th century. And of course, this was the time when the Crusades were ongoing, and so this is a particular study here on what was taking place in England at that time. And so I'm going to ask Pastor if you'd open with a word of prayer, and then we'll go into our study here this morning.
Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. We thank you for your care for us through the week. We thank you for the privilege to be able to come together and worship you. We ask for your blessing on the ministry throughout the day. We ask blessing on the worship also, that you would be honored and glorified. And we ask, Lord, the ministry, for your help to the ministry of your word now in Sunday school time, and all the teachers, and help us, Lord, as we continue here in this class. Help Stephen to teach us about church history, and that we be profited from it. We will serve you better in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay, thank you, Pastor. Now, it would be wonderful if we could complete our study on Becket today, because Becket was quite an interesting character, and his battle with King Henry is an interesting study, and we're going to be very close to the time of going over. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. But Andrew Miller, just for you that are not that familiar with him particularly, he was a Scottish businessman who moved to England. He lived between 1810 and 1883, and he wrote Miller's Church History in 1874, which was just like 9 years before he died. But when he moved to England, he was a businessman there, and he expected, as he was writing this chapter, that any English reader would really be curious about this particular element of study here. Because at this time that we're looking at, this is when the Anglo-Saxon heritage, which was started under Alfred the Great, it gave way to the Anglo-Norman rule of William the Conqueror. And both church and state were changed or changing during this period of time. The Roman Catholic Church wasn't going to miss out on an opportunity of possessing this country for its pride, its wealth, and power. And so in this chapter, what Miller highlights is the position of England at the time period, and then the nature and then the end of this struggle that took place, particularly between Henry II and Thomas Becket, who was Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, the Pope at this time was Alexander III, and he had great support from the Archbishop of Canterbury to give Rome more power over the country of England. And so they basically wanted to rule, they wanted Rome to rule over England the same way as it was doing on the continent. Remember, they had wielded great power against the Emperor of Rome, who incidentally also was a Henry. As I pointed out before, one of the confusing things about reading Miller's church history, if you're not looking up the names and finding out who he's particularly talking about, it can be very confusing, because the Holy Roman Emperors, many of them were named Henry, as we've studied before, Henry IV and that struggle he had with Pope Gregory VII. Well, now we're in England, and there were a number of Henrys in England as well. Probably remember Henry VIII. So in this period of time here, we're going to be dealing with Henry II, and it's interesting that the lines of the Henrys of England and the Henrys of the Royal Holy Roman Empire in Germany actually crossed with the daughter of Henry I. This is interesting because King Henry I in England was the son of William the Conqueror, who was married to Matilda of Flanders. And when they had their oldest son, Henry, he named his daughter also Matilda. And Matilda moved to Germany when she was a child, and she actually married Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, they were married, the emperor died before they were able to have any children, so she remarried to Geoffrey of Anjou, and their eldest son became Henry II. So this Matilda, her father was Henry I. She married Henry V of Germany. He died. She gets remarried, has a child who she names Henry II, and then he becomes the next king. So if you did not know that, and Miller is just saying Henry, you can really get lost in the study. But all of that genealogy there I find very interesting. But the way to be able to figure all of that out is as you're finding the name, put their birth and their death dates, because there's so many Henrys and so many Matildas, even in this case, you can lose track of them. Now, in between Henry I of England and Henry II of England, there was another king who ruled from 1135 to 1154. His name was King Stephen. And as much as I would like to hope that a king named Stephen would have been a good king, he was not. He was a failure. And we're going to see some of his failings in our study here. Now, the battle between the popes and the sovereign leaders of the nations was the result basically of the church trying to wield its power over the nations, trying to change them from the laws and customs which they originally followed to in adopting what is referred to as canon law or church law. And so this led to a great struggle because England had been maintaining its own customs and laws for centuries, and they were very proud of maintaining that legal system. Now, most of the European monarchs, they had already submitted to the Pope, and it was out of a superstitious fear that the Pope had control over their soul, and that if they did not submit, then the Pope could, lock them out of heaven, so to speak. And so they were afraid, and so superstitiously they gave in to that. Now, in England, things were different. Roman Catholicism did have great influence, but the kings had been very powerful in the past, and they really maintained that separation of what should be, as we read here, a separation of church and state, and they were holding on to that. They acknowledged, some of the early historians acknowledged that someone like the Saxon King Edward, who was the son of Alfred the Great, he told the clergy that they wielded the sword of St. Peter, but he the sword of Constantine. So he was making that distinction. A biographer of William the Conqueror, he said that all affairs, ecclesiastical as well as secular, were made dependent on his pleasure. And so it was up to the William the Conqueror, the king then, the Norman king of England, as to how things would be settled. Ultimately, he was the sovereign. But during the 12th century, this started to change, and Rome was wielding more and more influence over England. So when kings were strong, they were able to resist it. But when a weak king came along, that's when Rome took advantage. And that weak king, unfortunately, was named King Stephen. And he ruled, as I said, between 1135 and 1154. And this was when the Pope was able to gain the upper hand in England. Just like in Italy and France and Germany, Rome had control over the church property without any interference from the king's judges. So Henry I, before King Stephen came along, he stood solidly against the Archbishop of Canterbury. That man's name was Anselm, and there were two popes at the time that were both vying for the papal chair. Sometimes that would happen, as we've seen in our study. A pope would be appointed, another one might be trying, his buddies were trying to get him on the throne at the same time. They were unable to do it, and so there'd be two popes at the, conflicting with one another. And so when Henry I was ruling, Urban II and Clement III were the two popes at that time. And Anselm and Henry disagreed over who they were going to acknowledge was the true pope. And Henry won the argument. He bluntly proclaimed that he knew of no law or custom which entitled a subject, without the king's license, to set up a pope of his own over the kingdom of England, and that any man who should presume to take out of his hands the decision of that question would have as good a right to do that as to take the crown from his head. So he was very, very strong. He was saying, no, nobody, no subject, including you, the archbishop, tells me, the king, what to do. So the struggle between King Henry and that archbishop, Anselm, was a long one. It ultimately led to Anselm fleeing to Rome, and then the king seizing all the temporalities of the see. So all the secular properties and possessions of the church he took over, King Henry. So a papal officer was sent by the Pope to speak to the king, but the king wouldn't even hear him. And about 15 years later, the same Pope, still trying to make his gain in England, he does the same thing. He sends what the Roman Catholic Church refers to as a legate extraordinary. They have all kinds of interesting terms. It must have been they set up their own dictionary and made all their own definitions. So an ambassador of the Pope was called a legate extraordinary. But he had no better success. The Pope tried a third time, again, without success. But so then it was well established. King Henry I is not going to budge. Right? There's going to be no chance of anything happening, changing in England while he was on the throne. But as soon as he died, in 1135, the crafty Pope Alexander III, he thought, okay, this is my opportunity. This was when King Stephen came to the throne, and he was what Miller referred to as a feeble king. And this was how Rome made its way into England. Because even though the Anglican prelates, which are the highest ranking clergy of England, they protested in London, the Pope was able to persist and gain his power there. And the number one contributing factor to this was that the congregations of the churches were really ignorant of what was going on, and they didn't protest. They didn't protest against their priests. They didn't protest against the Pope. They just let things happen. And so the foreign priest then is able to prevail. Along with that, he also has all the clergy in support of him, and they were very secular at this time. And what we'll see is that a lot of the bishops were actually just carrying on, much like the knights and the barons of the land. They just had the title of bishop. And then the country was also in a miserable state. Stephen was such a horrible king that the economy and everything else was weak, and so it was just a recipe for a takeover. And the Pope Alexander III, seeing this opportunity, takes advantage of it. So, oh yes, I want to share this with you too. It's that the bishops of this day, many of them were warriors. They actually wore arms. They had military training. They often would engage in war. So the bishops, the pastors, supposedly, of churches were engaging in battles. They would seize the spoil. Along with that, perhaps burning people's property and such things. And so they were acting as barons more so than priests. And this was the condition of England then when Henry II came into power. That was in 1154. And this is what ultimately led then to the struggle between the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man named Thomas A. Becket, and King Henry II. And that's what our major focus is going to be on today, is the battle between Becket and Henry II. Now, Becket was born around 1119, and he studied in London and Paris, and then he returned to England. And he began working with the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, named Theobald. And he's a very well-educated man. He was concerned that, the Archbishop at that time, he was concerned that the young King Henry II would be very much like his father, the King Henry I, who very opposed to any Roman rule in England. So what he saw in the young Becket was somebody that he could use as a tool against the king and gain the upper hand. So this Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, he makes the recommendation to King Henry II that he appoints Becket as his chancellor. So the chancellor is the one who is second in power to the king. And so basically Becket has now become, from this recommendation, the second civil power in the realm of the land. And as such, he's able to then appoint who he wants as the bishops, as the abbots, heads of the monasteries, and all of this. And so he's able to fill any vacancies with people who would be like-minded to the Archbishop and like-minded to the Pope in Rome. So they can eventually gain the upper hand. So Thomas A. Becket as chancellor, this is the year 1158. And history records that Becket was a saint and a martyr, but Miller points out that he was a man of the world. You may have heard of Becket before. The story Canterbury Tales is about a pilgrimage of people going to the shrine of Becket. And so much of history lauds him as a great martyr and a great religious man. But as we see in this description Miller provides us with, that he was really a man of the world. He had an unusual combination of skills and abilities. He had been trained in those schools. He was very wise and prudent. He was a practiced statesman, but he was also a superior military leader. And at the same time, he's a churchman. So all these qualities all rolled into one individual. He was able to lead 700 knights to overthrow castles that were holding out against King Henry. So as chancellor, he's supporting the king. So the king would have opposition to him, and he would use his chancellor, Becket, to go out and fight a military battle against these holdouts throughout England. He was successful in that. He led an army in Normandy with 1,200 knights and 4,000 horsemen, and they were all raised and maintained at his at his leading and expense. So he was the one that was responsible for looking after that army, and he did so successfully. He attacked castles. He razed towns and cities to the ground. At the same time, he would be burning down houses and farms without any sense of pity. He also never showed any mercy to any opponent of his master. Yet, he was also a churchman. He was the Archdeacon of Canterbury. So it's quite a conflict. As you can see, there's no separation here between church and state. But this is not an unusual arrangement at this period in which we're studying. This was quite common. Bishops were often armed and at war. But when you think about it, the hypocrisy of that, someone who is supposed to be a shepherd of the people and helping the community, and then in another sense he's out there actually destroying them and just fulfilling his duties for the king. So some of the bishops then, they looked at Becket's accomplishments and so on with jealousy, envy that he was so powerful. They would probably like to be more like him rather than being grieved by the things that he was doing. So through this whole process, Becket became very wealthy and powerful and even magnificent because he was like second to the king. And so when people saw him they really respected him and looked up to him. Well, this was fine between him and Henry so long as they were pursuing their own interests. But when it came to a conflict between Becket wanting to please the Pope and Henry wanting to maintain the laws of England, then it led to a struggle between these two individuals. And at this point here, 1162, this is a year after Theobald dies, King Henry himself, he appoints Becket as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And as soon as he does that, everything changes. Even though Becket had pledged fealty to the king, after he's appointed as Archbishop, his loyalties go to the Pope. He no longer cares about the interests of King Henry anymore. And Becket knew that the king resisted the growing power of Rome, so he's actually betraying the man who had helped him, given him appointments, given him experience and power, and so on. But now he turns against King Henry and is willing to resist him at all costs. So by this point, the church was demanding complete exemption from secular law. So that the kings were maintaining the law of the land traditionally through all of the centuries, but now the Pope is wanting to impose canon law or church law on the country. And this led to a great conflict because for those that were involved in the civil government, they were finding that the church was getting in the way of them carrying out their administration. And this was particularly in the case where the church was insisting that any persons or property of the clergy were to be dealt with by their own superiors and dealt with according to the laws of the church, not the laws of the land. But this led to some really major problems because there were crimes that the clergy were committing that the church had no punishment for. And since they were now saying that these criminals were not going to be tried under the law of the land, they were going to be tried under canon law, and canon law didn't deal with them, basically they were getting away with murder. And there were murders taking place. The crimes that were committed at this time were heinous. There were hundreds of murders. There were rapes. There were crimes taking place, robberies, arson, theft by the clergy. Because remember, a lot of these clergymen were warriors. They were this mixture of men who were out fighting battles, committing crimes, and then under the protection of the church where they could do something wicked or evil and then have it covered up. And this reminds me very much of something that took place in Canada here not long ago, and throughout the world actually, where the Roman Catholic Church was protecting their priests who were engaging in wicked crimes, and they would not report them to the police. They would keep it all hidden. And so there's the Mount Cashel incident in Newfoundland, but there's been, many of these types of cases have taken place around the world. And this is the problem with it, where instead of these things being tried under a civil court, which would deal with them and lock these people up, then the church was taking them and protecting them and just moving them around. Hey, way back then, back in the 12th century, this was taking root. But lawlessness, of course, leads to violence. And so the result of Rome pushing canon law then led to an increase in crime throughout England. And so, as Miller pointed out, it was no less than 100 murders had taken place, and then the people were basically getting away with that. They could proclaim immunity by saying that they were under the protection of the church. And the church was not dealing with them. So they would go unpunished. So King Henry, he was determined to then put a stop to this. He was going to make the criminals answer for their crimes under the ancient laws and customs of the land. So he called a meeting together, had all the clergy come. He holds a parliament in Westminster, and he basically is insisting then that, okay, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to impose law. And he had no support at all. All of the clergy that were present, they said, those under the ancient laws and customs, they need to obey them, but they were excluding themselves. They're saying, but we're not under those. And so he had no support. So the king, feeling then that he was on his own, he broke up the assembly, he left London, and he began to deprive Becket of his power and privilege. So Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, from what I gathered in my study here, Becket was educating King Henry's son. So he takes that privilege away from him. And oddly, Becket gives in. He yielded under the reason for it was that he was actually yielding under the influence of Pope Alexander II, who told him, well, just go along with it. So Henry had also threatened to not send any more money to the Pope. So that's what the Pope cared more about. So long as when the king needed money, when the Pope needed money, then he would go along with the king. But if the circumstances were different and he could do without, then he would start advancing his program again. And so, what corruption? There's just a horrible state there. But the next thing that Henry does is he summons a great council in Clarendon to create what he called the Constitutions of Clarendon. Now, this place was a royal palace near Salisbury in the south of England. And what King Henry sought to do here was to have a concession, to have the clergy agree that the laws of the land are what are going to be carried out in the matter of crimes. And ultimately, the king's motive was peace and safety for his country. There's murders taking place, and the people are getting away with it. And so all of this turmoil and the protection that these criminals had under canon law is something that was interrupting the justice system, and ultimately it was going to lead to a battle between church and state. So the king had the laws and the customs all written out to be signed by the barons and bishops in the hope of settling the matter. Now, whether it was from fear of the king attacking them, or from their own policy and plan of treachery of how to get the king, Archbishop Becket, he surprisingly takes the oath and signs the king's constitution. He's followed by all his bishops. They're all agreeing to it. Well, this is wonderful. And they escape any punishment then from the king that might have been coming their way. But Becket had no intention at all of keeping his oath. The very deed that he signed, he immediately gets word to the Pope and says, annul this. say that it's not a legal document, say that it's not to be upheld by orders of the church, and to send me letters to absolve me and the bishops from all the promises that we made in this declaration. So that's pretty crafty, isn't it? And within a month, he had these papers. So while he was signing that and pledging an oath, it looks like he was intending never to uphold it. That's perjury. So this is the archbishop of the land swearing an oath in the name of Jesus, in the name of the church, under the cloak of Christianity, that he's agreeing to it and had no intention of carrying it out. And so now that he has this letter from the Pope absolving them from having to obey this decree which he had signed, then again the worst of crimes are excusable under the power of the Roman Catholic Church. And it just makes you wonder, and people, I'm sure, wondered at this time. It's like, how do they get away with this? And many times we marvel, right, when we see somebody committing such evil and then they seemingly are getting away with it. But we just only need to remind ourselves that there is a day of judgment that's coming. In Acts chapter 17, in verse 31, it says, "Because he, God, hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained." And so we never have to, wonder what will happen. There is a judgment day coming, and all these things have been recorded and written down. Well, Becket kept this game going. The Pope was informed all the while, so that the Pope knew what was going on, and he would just play along. He would humor the king at times when it was advantageous to do so, and at other times he'd move his agenda forward. So it comes to a point where Thomas Becket opposes the king straight out, and this was very much like the battle that took place between the Emperor Henry, remember Henry IV, and Pope Gregory VII. That battle that went on for 17 years. Such came of this battle between Becket and King Henry II. Becket, he resigned from being chancellor, and he returned all the seals of his office along with the privileges and power that position gave him, and he became a fully fledged monk. And so much so that he did all the things that you might expect a devout monk to do. He wore his haircloth shirt. He even flogged himself with an iron scourge. He was fasting on bread and water, laying on the hard floor, sleeping, and barely sleeping in those types of conditions, washing the feet of 13 beggars with his own hands every night. So why the change? Well, is all part of the craftiness of making himself look like the holy man. And if King Henry ever did anything to him, it would look like he was oppressing this innocent man of God. That he was somehow untouchable by this holiness that he had now as a monk. So Henry was disappointed. His star pupil, the one who he had promoted through the ranks, who he had helped and had gone, into battle with, and so on. His man who he had appointed not only as chancellor but also as the Archbishop of Canterbury has now turned against him. So, and Becket does turn against him in every possible way. And Miller gave a quote to summarize the situation. He said, the once able and compliant chancellor, Becket, from whom the king expected support and victory, had turned against him with the most ruthless animosity and pushed the pretensions of Rome to a pitch that they had never reached before. And so Becket is fully intending to carry out the Pope's mission now, and now that he's drawn the line in the sand, he does so without wavering. And it's not difficult to understand how the king must have felt after all this, because his whole purpose in engaging in this, what ended up in a conflict, was for the protection of his people. He's trying to deal with the criminals of the land. He was trying to have a law which would be carried out, law and order in the country. And so for Becket, now to to be such a hostile opposer to his plan is causing him great misery. So Becket, King Henry appeals to him a few times to see if he'll change his mind, but Becket refuses to, and then finally the king has to acknowledge that Becket is a traitor. And so, knowing the temperament of the king, then Becket fled out of the country. He went to France, and instead of the King of France treating him as a fugitive, he actually treats him like an honored guest. And then Becket is safe now, and he's got the protection of the King of France. So King Henry banished Becket's friends and his relations. He took measures then to cut off Becket's communication with them, cut off his email account and all that. And then in return, Becket excommunicated all of his opponents. So it's going back and forth like this. And this started a war between these two for 7 long years. And it only ended when the king submitted, because it was the Becket was so determined he was not going to waver at all, and he does not. Kind of give away the story, but it's the king that actually submits, and it's under the intercession of the King of France and of the Pope, and they say you should allow Becket to return, and unwisely he allows him to come back, and it's as if Becket comes back just gloating over his return. He's back as Archbishop of Canterbury. He demands the return of all the property which had been taken from the see before. He refused to absolve any of the bishops of excommunication. So it wasn't like, okay, well, let's have peace here. You've allowed me to come back. I'll absolve your guys. No, he still persists in that. And Becket remained so defiant before the king that one of the clergy told King Henry II, he said, "So long as Thomas lives, you will never have peace." And Henry replies with these words, "I am an unhappy prince. Will none revenge me on a single insolent priest who troubles me so much and makes void my authority?" Now, the words are disputed about what he actually said. Some other accounts of it are, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And someone else quoted him as saying, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric." But regardless of what he said, 4 warrior knights of the king took this as the command then that they should go and deal with Becket to take his life. And so these men, they were Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Reginald Brito. They disappeared from the court. And by the time that Henry realized that they were gone, it was too late for him to catch up to them. They had crossed some rivers and so on, and had made their way to Becket before King Henry could get someone to Becket, arrest him, keep him safe in custody before his knights arrived. Because King Henry did not want Becket assassinated, but these knights, they went out on their own. And it's a well-documented account of their encounter that the knights, they didn't immediately seek to slay Becket. In fact, they left their arms outside. They went into his chamber to talk to him to see if they could reason with him. But he was insolent priest, and they couldn't make any way with him. And Becket insults them, and so they go back out, they get their arms, and they come back in, but the doors had been locked behind them. Becket, in the meantime, is, amazingly, he just says it's not right to make a fortress out of the house of prayer. So the monks open up the door as he makes his way to his evening vespers, that evening devotion service. And Becket could have escaped. He knew that the knights had gone out to get their arms, but he goes to the altar, and he's standing there, and an altercation takes place where Becket is grotesquely slain on the altar. And the murderers fled. They first go to Rome to confess to the Pope, And the Pope then sends them to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, where they're to do out a lifelong penance. And the king then is greatly troubled by this news. In fact, the news is that he had sent his knights there to kill him. And that's the fake news that goes out across the land, is that the king had ordered this, and then Becket is plotted as a martyr. He looks like he was the good guy, the king was the evil guy who had killed him. And it was told then that he died under direct orders by the king. But for 3 days, the king he was fasting in solitude. He felt, as he later was quoted as saying, he felt more grieved over the Becket's assassination than the death of his own mother and father. And yet this didn't make any change in then how the Pope deals with him. Alexander II refused to hear him, threatened to excommunicate the king to take over his realm. But cooler heads in Rome prevailed, and they calmed down the Pope, saying, why don't you just take advantage of this? You've got King Henry right where you want him. And so, the number of days go by, the king is trying to make appeals, the Pope won't hear you, until finally, and this is so much like what Pope Gregory II did to the emperor. He finally allows him to come and see him, but it was to agree to a requirement. Henry would have to maintain 200 knights at his own cost in the Holy Land. Of course, it's the time of the Crusades, so he's carrying that out. Within 3 years, he would take the cross in person, unless released by the Holy See. He would abolish the constitutions of Clarendon, that idea of imposing the laws of the land instead of canon law to deal with the criminals. That was to be annulled, and then all the bad customs that King Henry had introduced during his reign. That he would reinvest the Church of Canterbury with all its rights and possessions, and pardon and restore all who had faced the king's wrath in the battle with Becket. And then, the ultimate humiliation, well, there's one more to come, is that he, King Henry, and his son would keep the crown of England faithful to Pope Alexander, and all of their successors would not regard themselves as true kings until the Pope crowned them as such. So it basically like, well, we're not really king, you, Pope, are the supreme authority over us. Amazingly, Henry agrees to this blackmail that's imposed upon him, and he signs a deed on May 22nd, 1172. But the Pope wasn't done humiliating Henry. I'm going to have to jump over a number of things here, but basically he degrades him one last time, having him go to the tomb of Becket. 3 years later, King Henry visits the tomb in Canterbury, and while the church is still off on the distance, he dismounts from his horse, walks barefoot over this rough road 3 miles to the church. He falls prostrate before the saint's tomb. He prays to be allowed to be scourged by the monks, who all come out and whip the king while he's there. They all take a turn on him while he's down on the ground, and then without any refreshments for the rest of the day and night, he's kneeling on bare stones before the tomb of him. Anyway, so it's like Rome had got Henry II right to where they wanted him. And finally, I'm just going to wrap things up here. Still some more details to share, but Becket, this scoundrel, basically became a saint in the eyes of all of the church. All the volumes of biographies and memoirs that are written about him all speak of him as the great martyr. But there's this history here about King Henry that is often ignored. And his tomb became a shrine, and pilgrimages and so on to his place of death became fashionable. Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales speaks of these pilgrims that were on their way there to make pilgrimage. As many as 100,000 visitors on one occasion visited his tomb. King Louis of the Seventh of France visited the tomb, giving the richest jewel in Christendom to the shrine. but not everyone paid obeisance to the scoundrel, and perhaps it was to preserve his namesake. But when King Henry VIII came along, he actually pillaged the shrine. He had Becket's body dug up, burned, and then his ashes cast into the wind. So that's the ultimate end to the story of Becket. So the next time that we're together, we're going to be looking at the theology of the Church of Rome. So we're going to be in chapter 23, Miller's Church History, and so it's looking at the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, what they are, the origin of them, and so on. But anyway, it's a remarkable story. Now, I just want to close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we do thank you, Lord God, for being able to look back at history. We thank you for those who stood for truth and righteousness, and we realize, Lord, and understand that no one will get away with evil, but we're thankful that we know that's true for us as well, that we're all sinners. We've all come short of the glory of God, but we thank you for the finished work of Christ, which makes it possible for our sins to be forgiven. Help us to be faithful to you and to your Son and to the Word. And just thank you for this lesson here. And we realize, Lord, many times history repeats itself, and we can see that as we study ancient history. We see these things carried out many, many times. But Lord, thank you. We don't have to be ignorant of them. We can know how to approach things in a way that would please you. So I just pray for your guidance and direction and your leading in